12 of the world's most powerful CEOs sat around the mahogany table, their Mont Blanc pens poised over memorandums worth $1.9 billion. I'd spent half my lifetime building the trust in this room. Then, right before the signatures could flow, I was fired publicly, brutally, in front of everyone. Not a single person knew that his words had just triggered a hidden clause, one that would obliterate everything. He thought he'd destroyed me. In reality, he'd just detonated his own empire. My name is Evelyn Hart, and until 11:37 this morning, I was the Senior Vice President of International Relations at Meridian Global Enterprises. The Ritz-Carlton's presidential boardroom had never looked more imposing, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Central Park, Italian marble gleaming under crystal chandeliers, and 12 leather portfolios arranged with military precision, each containing contracts that would reshape global supply chains for the next decade. I'd choreographed every detail of this summit. The CEO from Tokyo preferred his documents bound in navy blue. The Frankfurt executive needed everything in both English and German, with subsections clearly tabbed. The delegation from Dubai required halal catering and prayer time at 12:45. These weren't just preferences I'd memorized, they were relationships I'd cultivated through countless red-eye flights, embassy dinners, and 3 a.m. crisis calls when deals teetered on cultural misunderstandings. The air hummed with that particular electricity that only exists when billions of dollars hover in the balance. I moved between the executives, greeting each in their native language, a small gesture that always shifted the room's energy from transactional to personal. The Norwegian CEO, Magnus Eriksson, actually smiled when I asked about his daughter's violin recital in Oslo. These men didn't smile in boardrooms unless they meant it. Everything was perfect. The contracts were ready, pre-reviewed by legal teams across 4 continents. The ceremonial pen's Mont Blanc Patron of Art series, each one personally selected to match the recipient's taste, lay in velvet boxes beside each portfolio. Even the lighting had been adjusted to ensure the signing photographs would capture the historic moment without harsh shadows. Then Lucas Grant walked in. Our new CEO, 3 months into the role, armed with an MBA from Wharton and the board's misguided confidence, entered the room like he owned not just the company, but the very air we breathed. His Tom Ford suit cost more than most people's cars, and he wore it like armor. Behind him trailed 2 security guards I didn't recognize, and Margaret from HR, her face pale, clutching a manila folder. "Gentlemen," Lucas announced, his voice cutting through the pre-signing murmur. "I apologize for the interruption, but we need to address an urgent personnel matter before we proceed." The room fell silent. The kind of silence that costs money every second these executives waited was measured in lost opportunities elsewhere. I set down my tablet, my fingers steady despite the sudden ice in my veins. Lucas turned to me, his smile sharp as broken glass. "Evelyn Hart, effective immediately. Your employment with Meridian Global Enterprises is terminated. Security will escort you from the building. Margaret has your termination paperwork." The words hung in the air like smoke from a fired gun. 12 pairs of eyes swiveled between Lucas and me. Someone's coffee cup clinked against its saucer, the only sound in a room that had gone tomb quiet. "I see," I said, my voice carrying the same tone I'd used to negotiate through a hostage situation in Sao Paulo 2 years ago. Calm, measured, giving nothing away. Lucas's smile widened, mistaking my composure for defeat. He wanted me to break, to beg, to make a scene that would justify his power play to these witnesses. Instead, I straightened my shoulders, smoothed my dress the same Saint Laurent I'd worn to close the Singapore deal, and looked him directly in the eye. "Of course, Mr. Grant, I understand completely." I picked up my leather portfolio, the one containing my personal notes from 15 years of relationship building, and tucked it under my arm. "Gentlemen," I addressed the room, making eye contact with each CEO. "It has been an honor." As security moved toward me, unnecessary, theatrical. I noticed something Lucas hadn't: the subtle shift in the room's atmosphere. Magnus Eriksson's jaw had tightened. Takeshi Yamamoto from Tokyo was already reaching for his phone. The Frankfurt executive, Klaus Weber, had closed his portfolio with a soft but definitive snap. Lucas, drunk on his own performance, had already turned away from me, moving toward my seat at the table's center. Now then, gentlemen, let's proceed with this historic signing. I'm sure you'll find I'm more than capable of handling these negotiations personally. I walked toward the door with measured steps, each click of my heels on marble counting down to something Lucas couldn't see coming. Margaret tried to hand me the folder, but I didn't take it, not yet. There was something else I needed to witness first. As my hand touched the door handle, I heard Klaus Weber's voice, cold and precise. Mr. Grant, before we proceed, perhaps you could clarify something about Section 12, subsection J of the memorandum. I paused, my back to the room, and allowed myself the smallest smile. Lucas wouldn't know Section 12, subsection J, if it was tattooed on his forehead, but I knew he was about to learn exactly what it meant. The door closed behind me with a whisper, but I knew the explosion was already beginning. 15 years. That's how long it took to build what Lucas Grant thought he could inherit with a signature and a power suit. I started at Meridian as a junior translator, fresh from Georgetown with a master's in international relations and fluency in 6 languages. My first day, I was thrown into a conference call with angry suppliers from Shenzhen at 2 a.m. The senior executive handling the account had botched the cultural protocols, offering contract terms that, in Mandarin business culture, read as profound disrespect. I saved that deal with one phrase: "We acknowledge our mistake and humbly request your guidance." 7 words that salvaged a $40 million contract. The executive got the credit, but word spread. Soon, I was the one they called when negotiations went sideways. The Damascus steel deal in 2012, I flew into a city on the edge of civil war because our competitors wouldn't. The Barcelona pharmaceutical merger in 2015, I spent 3 months learning Catalan. Not just Spanish, because the CEO valued his regional identity. The Moscow energy contract in 2018, I sat through 17-hour negotiations, drinking vodka with oligarchs who tested every word for weakness, never showing that I'd memorized their entire business history, including the deals they'd lost. Each success cost something. My marriage to David ended in 2016, finalized over email while I was mediating a crisis in Mumbai. He'd wanted children, a house in Connecticut, Sunday dinners. I'd given him Thursday arrivals and Monday departures, phone calls from airport lounges, and apologies wrapped in duty-free perfume. The divorce papers were in German. I'd been in Berlin when they arrived, and I signed them between meetings, my hands steady as always. I missed my father's 70th birthday for the Rio negotiations, my sister's wedding for the Seoul summit. My mother's cancer diagnosis came via text while I was closing the biggest deal of my career in Stockholm. By the time I made it home, she had 3 weeks left. I spent them by her bedside, translating her favorite Italian novels aloud, the only gift I had left to give. But every sacrifice built something larger. Trust, not the kind you can manufacture with firm handshakes and corporate platitudes, but the deep, generational trust that makes $100 billion industries run on verbal agreements. When Magnus Eriksson's son was kidnapped in Colombia, I connected him with fixers who got the boy home safely. When Yamamoto's company faced a hostile takeover, I brokered the alliance that saved it. When Klaus Weber's daughter needed experimental treatment in Boston, I navigated the FDA approval personally. These men didn't sign contracts with Meridian Global. They signed with me. Lucas never understood this. He'd arrived 3 months ago with his consultant's vocabulary and his disruption rhetoric, talking about pivot strategies and aggressive repositioning. He saw my Rolodex of relationships as old-fashioned, my methods as antiquated. In his world, business was about leverage and pressure points, not about knowing that the Saudi prince's nephew had autism and that mentioning the charity I'd helped establish for special needs children in Riyadh would soften any negotiation. He'd started undermining me immediately, scheduling critical calls during my flights, forgetting to include me in strategy sessions, telling the board I was resistant to innovation. What he meant was, I'd refused to strong-arm our partners in Osaka into accepting a 40% price increase. I'd warned him they'd walk. He'd laughed, said they needed us too much. They walked, took their $800 million in annual revenue with them. But Lucas spun it as my failure, my inability to adapt to modern negotiation tactics. The board, dazzled by his PowerPoints and profit projections, bought it. They didn't see what I saw, that he was strip-mining relationships I'd spent decades building. trading long-term alliances for quarterly gains. 6 weeks ago, he'd announced a restructuring of international operations. My team was cut in half, my travel budget slashed, my direct line to the board severed. He'd installed his own people aggressive, monolingual MBAs who thought culture was something you discussed in diversity seminars. I'd watched them fumble through calls with Mumbai, alienate partners in Prague, offend executives in Johannesburg. Each mistake cost us not just money but credibility. The currency I'd spent 15 years accumulating was being burned for kindling. So when Lucas scheduled this summit, his grand gesture to prove he could handle my responsibilities, I knew what was coming. The termination was inevitable. The only question was the timing, and Lucas, with his flair for drama and his need for witnesses to his conquest, had chosen the perfect stage. What he didn't know was that I'd been preparing for this moment since his first day. Every relationship I'd built, every favor I'd banked, every secret I'd kept, they were all mine, not Meridian's. The company owned my contracts, my reports, my official communications, but they couldn't own the trust. That traveled with me. And in 6 months of watching Lucas operate, I'd learned his fatal flaw. He never read the fine print. He signed whatever legal put in front of him, trusting his MBA and his arrogance to carry him through. He'd never noticed the subtle changes I'd made to the memorandums, the safeguards I'd embedded, the protection I'd built not for Meridian Global, but for the only asset that truly mattered, the relationships themselves. As I stood in that hallway, listening to the muffled voices through the boardroom door, I knew Lucas was about to discover the difference between power and influence. Power was firing me in front of 12 witnesses. Influence was what happened next. The signs had been there for weeks, scattered like breadcrumbs through conference rooms and email chains. Lucas had started using phrases like fresh perspective and dynamic energy in every meeting, his eyes sliding past me as if I were already a ghost. He'd hired a consultant, Bradley something, with veneered teeth and a habit of using synergy as a verb, who shadowed me for a week, taking notes on my processes and methodologies. "We need to modernize our approach, Evelyn," Lucas had said during a partner review meeting, his tone suggesting I was a relic he'd discovered in storage. "The old ways of doing business, the dinners, the gifts, the personal touch, they're inefficient. Our shareholders want lean operations, not relationship theater." Relationship theater, that's what he called 15 years of trust building, as if knowing that our Mumbai partner's daughter had just started at Yale, or that our contact in Berlin collected first edition Goethe, was mere performance. He wanted to replace human connection with algorithms and automated follow-ups, transform negotiation into a spreadsheet exercise. The first real warning came when he restructured the sold deal presentation. I'd spent 3 weeks preparing a nuanced approach that acknowledged their recent losses in the semiconductor market while offering a face-saving partnership structure. Lucas scrapped it overnight, replacing it with an aggressive takeover proposal that he'd clearly lifted from some Harvard Business Review case study. "They're weakened," he'd announced to the board, excitement glittering in his eyes. "This is when you strike." I'd tried to explain that Korean business culture would view this as predatory, that we'd lose not just this deal, but every connection in the region. He'd dismissed my concerns as outdated cultural sensitivity. The sole partners didn't just reject the proposal, they issued a formal statement distancing themselves from Meridian Global. Our reputation in Asia took a hit we still hadn't recovered from. But Lucas spun it differently to the board. According to his version, I'd sabotaged the negotiation by undermining executive authority and confusing partners with mixed messages. The board members, most of whom had never left the continent for business, nodded along to his PowerPoints filled with cherry-picked metrics and conveniently edited email chains. Then came the Mumbai incident. Our partner there, Rajesh Patel, had invited me to his daughter's wedding, a 3-day celebration in Jodhpur that would coincide with crucial contract renewals. Lucas forbade me from attending, calling it an inappropriate use of company resources. Instead, he sent Bradley with a standard renewal contract. No negotiation. Take it or leave it. Rajesh called me personally at 3 a.m. my time, his voice thick with controlled anger. 15 years. Evelyn, 15 years I have worked with you, and you send me this boy who cannot even pronounce my name correctly." I'd managed to salvage it with a personal video message and a promise to visit soon, but the damage was done. Lucas had shown them exactly how little he valued the relationship. The pattern accelerated. He'd schedule urgent strategy sessions during my established check-in calls with partners. He'd revise my negotiation plans hours before meetings, inserting aggressive terms that I'd have to dance around in real time. He'd copy the board on emails questioning my methodology and cultural assumptions, framing experience as inflexibility. 2 months ago, he'd brought in his own team, what he called negotiation specialists. They were management consultants who'd never closed a real international deal, armed with frameworks and theories but no understanding of the human element. Sarah Brennan was assigned as my shadow, supposedly to learn but really to report back on everything I did. "Why do you send birthday cards to the partners?" she'd asked, genuinely puzzled. "Isn't that unprofessional?" I'd tried to explain that the CEO in Oslo had mentioned once, 5 years ago, that no one remembered his birthday because it fell on a national holiday. That single card every year had secured us preferential treatment worth millions. But Sarah just typed into her tablet, probably noting it as another inefficiency. The final preparation for the coup came last month. Lucas announced a new transparency initiative, where all international communications would go through a central system he controlled. My direct lines to partners, cultivated over decades, were to be rerouted through corporate channels. It was designed to cut me off from my network, to make me just another employee rather than the bridge between Meridian and half the global market. I'd protested, privately at first, then in a board meeting where I'd laid out exactly what we stood to lose. The board members shifted uncomfortably, but Lucas had come prepared with a presentation about regulatory compliance and corporate governance. He'd made it sound like my personal relationships were a liability, a risk to the company's reputation. That's when I knew it wasn't just about replacing me, it was about erasing me. He wanted to eliminate any trace of how these deals had really been built, rewrite history with himself as the architect of Meridian's international success. The summit, this grand signing ceremony, was to be his coronation. What Lucas never understood, trapped in his consultant's bubble, was that in international business, the person is the deal. Every contract, every partnership, every alliance was built on personal trust. You couldn't simply substitute one face for another like changing a tire. The relationships weren't with Meridian Global, they were with me. And while Lucas had been planning his public execution, I'd been ensuring that when he pulled the trigger, he'd be shooting himself in the foot. The beauty of it was that every safeguard I'd put in place looked like standard business practice. Every protective measure appeared to benefit the company. Lucas had approved them all, seeing only the surface, never the structure beneath. He thought he was inheriting an empire. He was about to discover it was built on sand. And I was the only one who knew where the bedrock lay. 6 months ago, when Lucas was still honeymoon drunk on his new title, I'd seen the future with perfect clarity. During a late-night session preparing the framework for today's summit, I'd suggested we add what I called the diplomatic continuity clause to each memorandum of understanding. The way I'd presented it to Lucas, it was a safeguard for our partners, ensuring that if key personnel changed during the negotiation process, they'd have the right to reassess terms. "It shows good faith," I'd explained, watching him half listen while scrolling through his phone. "These executives are committing billions based on relationships. They deserve assurance that those relationships will remain stable through the contract execution." Lucas had waved his hand dismissively. "Fine, whatever makes them comfortable. Just don't let it slow down the timeline." The clause was elegant in its simplicity. Should the primary liaison designated by Meridian Global Enterprises be replaced, terminated, or removed from their position prior to final contract execution, all parties reserve the right to void preliminary agreements and memorandums of understanding without penalty, with immediate effect. I'd crafted it in language so standard, so bureaucratically bland, that it had sailed through legal review without a second glance. Our corporate lawyers, focused on liability and indemnification, missed the nuclear bomb hidden in plain sight. Lucas signed off on it along with 40 pages of other documentation, probably during his Tesla's autopilot commute. But the real mastery was in how I'd presented it to each CEO individually. During our pre-summit conversations, those inefficient personal calls Lucas so despised, I'd explained the clause differently to each partner, tailored to their specific concerns. To Magnus Eriksson, still scarred from a hostile takeover that had destroyed a 20-year partnership, I'd framed it as protection against corporate instability. If Meridian shows signs of internal upheaval, you're not locked in. I'd told him during a call to Oslo at 11 at night my time, 6 in the morning his, to Yamamoto in Tokyo. I'd emphasized the honor aspect. This ensures that the person who gave their word is the person who keeps it, I'd said in Japanese, using the specific form that conveyed deep respect. He'd understood immediately in Japanese business culture. Changing negotiators mid-deal was considered a grave insult. Klaus Weber from Frankfurt had appreciated the pure risk management angle. It's a dead man's switch, I'd explained. If something happens to me, illness, accident, anything, you're not bound to terms negotiated with someone who might not understand the nuances we've discussed. Each CEO had agreed readily, even enthusiastically. Several had their own legal teams request similar clauses for their side. It became a multilateral safety net, woven through every document. What looked like standard protection was actually a poison pill that Lucas had swallowed without tasting. But the clause alone wouldn't have been enough. Lucas could have potentially negotiated around it, offered concessions, found ways to maintain the deals despite my absence. That's where the second layer came in the authentication protocols. 3 months ago, when Lucas mandated that all international contracts use digital signatures for efficiency and security, I'd volunteered to oversee the implementation. He'd been thrilled, probably thinking I was finally embracing his modernization agenda. I'd worked with our IT security team to create a state-of-the-art system: biometric authentication, encrypted keys, time-stamped verification. What I didn't tell anyone was that I'd built in a personal authentication layer for all contracts over $500 million. The system required not just Meridian's corporate digital signature, but a second key one linked to my personal biometric data and a physical security token I carried. I'd presented it to the board as an anti-fraud measure, protecting against potential cyber attacks or internal malfeasance. Two-person integrity, I'd called it, using military terminology that appealed to our ex-Pentagon board member. No single person, not even the CEO, can unilaterally commit the company to deals of this magnitude. The board had loved it. Lucas had loved it even more. Seeing it as a way to control my ability to make deals without him, he never realized the inverse was also true. He couldn't make deals without me. The security token itself was a masterpiece of misdirection. It looked like a standard corporate key fob, the kind every executive carried for building access. But inside was a rolling encryption key that synchronized with a server I'd had installed in our Dublin office, ostensibly for EU data protection compliance. The server was corporate property, but the authentication sequence was mine alone. It thought it was a standard security measure. Legal thought it was a compliance requirement. Lucas thought it was his idea. I'd also made sure that each international partner received documentation about our enhanced security protocols, explaining that any contracts would require dual authentication as a protection against fraud. They'd appreciated the extra security, especially given recent high-profile corporate hacking incidents. Several had asked for similar systems on their end. The result was a web of interdependencies that all led back to me. The diplomatic clause meant they could walk if I was removed. The authentication system meant new contracts couldn't be executed without me. And the personal relationships meant that even if Lucas found legal ways around both obstacles, the partners would choose to walk anyway. As I'd put each piece in place over the past 6 months, I'd felt like a chess player setting up a board where every possible move led to the same outcome. Lucas thought he was playing checkers, jumping over pieces to reach the other side. He was about to learn it was actually 3-dimensional chess, and I'd been playing it while he was still learning which way the pieces moved. The token sat in my jacket pocket now, warm against my ribs as I stood in the hallway, inside that boardroom. Lucas was about to discover that firing me wasn't his power play, it was mine. The security token in my pocket wasn't just a key, it was a dead man's switch for $1.9 billion in contracts. But even that wasn't my final safeguard. The real masterstroke was the digital signature system itself, a labyrinth of authentication that I'd designed to be irreplaceable. When Lucas had pushed for digital transformation, I'd suggested we partner with a boutique cryptography firm in Zurich, Crypto Vault Solutions. They specialized in military-grade encryption for Swiss banks. What Lucas didn't know was that the firm's founder, Andreas Richter, owed me his company's existence. 5 years ago, I'd connected him with his first major client when he was operating out of a converted garage. He'd never forgotten. Together, Andreas and I had created something unprecedented, a nested authentication system that looked standard from the outside, but was actually a digital fortress. The primary layer used Meridian's corporate credentials. Simple enough. The secondary layer required biometric data fingerprint and retinal scan from the designated signatory, still standard for high-security transactions. But the third layer was where it became art. It required a rolling 256-bit encryption key generated by my personal token, synchronized with atomic clock servers in 3 locations: Dublin, Tokyo, and New York. The synchronization algorithm was proprietary, developed specifically for Meridian, but accessible only through my personal authentication. If the token was destroyed or lost, the entire system would lock down, requiring a manual reset that would take weeks and involve flying an Andreas from Zurich. I'd explained the basics to our IT department, but the full architecture was documented in a 500-page technical manual that I'd bet my reputation Lucas had never opened. Our chief technology officer, David Park, had signed off on it after I'd assured him it exceeded every international security standard. What I hadn't mentioned was that those standards were ones I'd helped write during my time consulting for the UN's International Trade Commission. The beauty of the system was its integration. Every major contract in the pipeline, not just today's summit deals, had been migrated to this platform over the past 3 months. Lucas had celebrated it as the efficiency victory, cutting document processing time by 60%. He'd even taken credit for it in the last board meeting, claiming it was part of his modernization initiative. But there was another element, one that even Andreas didn't know about. Hidden in the authentication protocol was a time-sensitive component. Each signature was only valid for a 72-hour window from the moment of preliminary agreement. After that, the entire contract would need to be re-authenticated from scratch. I'd sold this to legal as a protection against contract manipulation, ensuring that no one could sit on a signed deal and alter terms later. What it really meant was that Lucas had less than 3 days to figure out a system that had taken me 6 months to build, or watch every deal evaporate. The token itself was a marvel of engineering paranoia. It wasn't just encrypted, it was bio-locked. Every 12 hours, it required my thumbprint to remain active. Without that confirmation, it would automatically wipe its memory and reset to factory defaults. I'd been refreshing it this morning at 5:45, as I had every morning for the past 3 months, building an unbreakable routine. But the real genius wasn't in the technology, it was in the documentation. Every security measure, every protocol, every safeguard had been approved by Lucas himself. His signature was on every authorization, every implementation order, every security upgrade. If he tried to bypass or disable the system now, he'd be violating his own security mandates. The board would see it as either gross incompetence or potential fraud. I'd also made sure our insurance policies specifically excluded coverage for contracts executed outside our approved security protocols. Bypass the system, and Meridian would be personally liable for any losses, no corporate protection, no limited liability. Lucas would be risking not just the company's money but his own assets, his house in the Hamptons, his portfolio, everything. 2 weeks ago, I'd given a presentation to our partners about the security system at Lucas's insistence. Ironically, he'd wanted to showcase Meridian's technological advancement. I'd walk them through every protection, every safeguard, emphasizing how their investments were protected by unprecedented security measures. They'd been impressed. Several had asked for copies of the presentation for their own boards. What that meant was that every CEO in that room knew that their contracts required my personal authentication. They knew the security protocols. They knew that any attempt to execute contracts without proper authentication would be invalid and potentially fraudulent. If Lucas tried to force through deals without my signature, he wouldn't just be breaking internal protocols, he'd be attempting to defraud 12 international corporations. The token grew warmer in my pocket, a small weight that anchored an entire corporate empire. Inside, its circuits were counting down, waiting for the next authentication window. In 11 hours and 14 minutes, it would demand my thumbprint again. By then, Lucas would have discovered that firing me hadn't freed him from my influence, it had activated a countdown he couldn't stop. I'd prepared for this moment like a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. Every tool was sterilized, every contingency planned, every possible complication anticipated. But unlike surgery, where the goal was to save the patient, my operation was designed for a different outcome. Lucas thought he was cutting me out like a tumor. He was about to discover he'd just severed his own artery, and I was the only one who knew how to stop the bleeding. The elevator arrived with a soft chime. As I stepped inside, I could hear raised voices from the boardroom, the first signs that the CEOs were asking questions Lucas couldn't answer. The documents they were looking at required 2 signatures, Meridian Global's corporate seal, which Lucas controlled, and a second digital signature that was currently writing down to the lobby in my pocket. Without both, those weren't contracts. They were very expensive paper. The elevator had barely closed when my phone buzzed. Sarah Brennan, Lucas's shadow, who'd been studying my every move, was texting frantically, "What's Section 12J, Mr. Grant needs to know now?" I didn't respond. Let her panic. Let them all panic. By the time I reached the lobby, my phone showed 17 missed calls. I recognized the numbers: Margaret from HR, David Park from IT, 3 from Lucas himself. The security guards at the reception desk looked up as I passed, confusion on their faces. They'd probably been told to revoke my access immediately, but I was already leaving. I handed my corporate keycard to the younger guard, the one who always asked about my travels. "Take care, Ms. Hart," he said quietly, something knowing in his eyes. I pushed through the revolving doors into the Manhattan afternoon, and that's when I heard the sound of a corporate empire beginning to crack. My phone rang again. This time, it was Magnus Eriksson. "Evelyn," his voice was carefully neutral. "I'm calling from the boardroom. Mr. Grant seems unfamiliar with the diplomatic continuity clause. Could you enlighten us?" I could hear the barely controlled chaos in the background, voices overlapping, papers shuffling, Lucas's sharp tone cutting through intermittently. "Magnus, the clause is quite clear. My termination voids all preliminary agreements. It's on page 47 of your memorandum, Section 12, subsection J." "I see." A pause. "And Mr. Grant just informed us you're no longer with the company." "That's correct. As of 11:37 this morning." I heard him relay this to the room in Norwegian. He was making sure his team understood first. Then, louder, in English. "Mr. Grant, according to the diplomatic continuity clause you signed, Ms. Hart's termination automatically voids this memorandum." Lucas's voice, distant but distinct. "That's ridiculous. I'm the CEO. I have full authority." "Authority to break your own contracts." That was Klaus Weber, his German accent sharpening with displeasure. This clause was included specifically to prevent such instability. I stood on the corner of 57th and 5th, watching the city flow around me while listening to Lucas's world collapse in real time. Magnus had put me on speaker without saying so, a courtesy that let me hear everything while maintaining plausible deniability. "Gentlemen, please." Lucas was scrambling now, his Wharton confidence crumbling. "This is clearly a misunderstanding. We can proceed with the signatures and address any concerns." "Proceed with what signatures?" Yamamoto's voice cut through like a blade. "The authentication system requires Ms. Hart's personal validation. She established this with us 3 months ago. Without her digital signature, these documents are meaningless. Our IT department can reset the system." "In violation of your own security protocols." This was someone new, probably the legal counsel from the Dubai delegation. "The same protocols you personally assured us were inviolable." I heard chairs scraping, the distinctive sound of expensive leather portfolios closing, the thunder of a billion-dollar deal collapsing. "Wait." Lucas's desperation was bleeding through now. "The contracts are still valid. We can work around your own chief negotiator, the person who built these relationships." Magnus's voice had gone arctic. "Mr. Grant, do you think we're fools? We didn't come here to sign papers. We came here to formalize partnerships with someone we trust. That person just walked out your door." "She's trying to sabotage." "Sabotage." Klaus Weber laughed, but there was no humor in it. She built in protections that we requested. You signed them. You authorized them. The only sabotage here is your decision to terminate the one person holding these deals together. My phone buzzed with another call. Andreas from Zurich. I let it go to voicemail. But his text came through immediately. System lockdown initiated as per protocol. Lucas Grant attempting unauthorized access. All contracts frozen pending your biometric confirmation. The voices from the boardroom grew more heated. I heard Lucas trying to offer concessions, reduced prices, extended terms, anything to keep the CEOs from walking. But these weren't men who could be bought with desperation discounts. They'd been disrespected, and in international business, respect was worth more than money. Mr. Grant? Yamamoto's voice carried the weight of finality. In my culture, we have a saying, trust takes years to build and seconds to destroy. You've just demonstrated that Meridian Global does not value the years invested in these relationships. The Oslo Group will be reviewing all existing contracts with Meridian, Magnus announced. If this is how you treat your senior executives, how can we trust you with our investments? One by one, I heard them leaving. The sound of 12 powers walking away from a table Lucas thought he owned. His voice grew more frantic, offering impossible promises, making commitments he couldn't keep. But the room was emptying. This is her fault. Lucas's control finally shattered completely. She planned this. She protected us, Klaus Weber interrupted. And apparently, she was right to do so. Good day, Mr. Grant. The line went silent except for Lucas's heavy breathing and what sounded like Margaret from HR trying to offer him water. Then I heard something that made everything worth it, the ping of emails hitting servers. One by one, the CEOs were sending formal notifications to Meridian's board, informing them that due to internal instability and breach of diplomatic protocols, they were withdrawing from negotiations. My phone rang once more. This time it was Richard Blackstone, chairman of Meridian's board. Evelyn. His voice was carefully controlled. I'm going to need you to explain what just happened. What happened, Richard, is that Lucas Grant just cost you $1.9 billion in signed contracts, the diplomatic continuity clause and authentication protocols, all of which he personally approved, were triggered by my termination. I'd be happy to discuss this further, but as of 43 minutes ago, I no longer work for Meridian Global. Silence. Then, what would it take to undo this? I looked up at the Meridian building, its glass face reflecting the afternoon sun. Somewhere up there, Lucas was learning that power without foundation was just borrowed time. Richard, even if I wanted to help, which I don't, the system is now in lockdown. The contracts have expired. The CEOs have withdrawn. The trust is broken. You can't undo this any more than you can unring a bell. Evelyn. However, I continued, walking toward the Starbucks where I'd already arranged to meet my lawyer. I'll be available for consulting. My rate is $5,000 per hour, with a minimum engagement of 100 hours. Have Lucas call me if he'd like to discuss it. I hung up and turned off my phone. Inside the coffee shop, my lawyer was already waiting with a smile and a stack of papers, non-compete agreements, that were now toilet paper. Since Meridian had terminated me without cause, the security token in my pocket would expire in 10 hours and 28 minutes, taking with it any possibility of recovering those contracts. But I wasn't thinking about that. I was thinking about the 12 CEOs who were, at this moment, probably comparing notes in their private cars, discussing the spectacular implosion they'd just witnessed, and I was certain that before the day ended, my phone would have 12 new messages, each offering me opportunities that Lucas Grant could never touch. By 3:15 that afternoon, Lucas Grant's empire was in full collapse. I watched it unfold from my lawyer's office, where we'd set up a makeshift war room to monitor the situation. The financial news channels had already picked up the story. Meridian Global loses 1.9 B in deals after executive termination. The stock price was in freefall, down 18% and dropping. My lawyer, Jennifer Hartley, had connected her laptop to the conference room screen, displaying a live feed of Meridian's corporate emails, a perfectly legal arrangement. Since I still had access for another 8 hours as per company policy, the board members were in full panic mode. Richard Blackstone's email to the board at 3:22. Emergency meeting now, boardroom, Lucas Grant to explain immediately. CFO Michael Torres at 3:24. Can someone explain why our authentication system is completely locked? It says only Heart can unlock it. General Counsel Patricia Wu at 327. The diplomatic continuity clause is ironclad. We approved it ourselves. Legal exposure if we try to circumvent. But the most satisfying message came from Lucas himself. Sent to all senior staff at 331. Technical difficulties with documentation, all resolved shortly, business as usual. Jennifer laughed. Technical difficulties. That's what he's calling this. Through my network of contacts still in the building, I heard what was really happening. Lucas had barricaded himself in his office, screaming at IT to break the authentication system. David Park had apparently refused, stating it would violate federal cybersecurity laws and void their insurance. Legal had been called in and confirmed that any attempt to bypass the security protocols would constitute fraud. At 3:45, my phone turned back on for strategic purposes. Received a call from Klaus Weber. Evelyn, I'm calling from my plane. We're returning to Frankfurt, but I wanted you to know that I've just sent a formal letter to Meridian's board. We're pulling all existing contracts with them, effective immediately. The trust is gone. I understand. Klaus. No, I don't think you do. We're also sending letters to the SEC and the European Trade Commission, a CEO who fires his chief negotiator during active negotiations, triggering massive losses, while apparently being unaware of his own contracts that suggests either gross incompetence or deliberate fraud. Either way, it needs investigation. The implications hit like a sledgehammer. An SEC investigation would freeze Meridian's operations for months. Their European subsidiaries would be paralyzed. By 4 o'clock, 3 more CEOs had called with similar messages. Yamamoto was particularly cutting his company was not only withdrawing from current negotiations, but also filing a formal complaint with the Tokyo Stock Exchange about Meridian's deceptive business practices. At 4:18, the news broke wider. Bloomberg had the story. Meridian Partners alleged deception. Call for SEC investigation. The stock price crashed through the floor, down 31%. Trading was halted. Inside Meridian, according to my sources, it was chaos. The PR team had walked out of Lucas's office after he'd blamed them for not controlling the narrative. The head of investor relations had apparently laughed in his face when asked to fix this. 3 senior VPs had already submitted resignations, effective immediately. At 4:37, Richard Blackstone called again. The board has voted, he said without preamble. Lucas Grant has been terminated. Effective immediately, the position of CEO is yours if you want it. I let the silence stretch, savoring it. Richard, you just publicly humiliated me in front of the most powerful people in international business. You allowed Lucas to destroy 15 years of my work, and now you want me to come back and clean up his mess. Name your terms. I don't think you can afford my terms. Try me. I looked at Jennifer, who nodded. We'd discussed this possibility. 5-year contract, guaranteed. 15 million base salary. 20% equity stake in the company. Full autonomy over international operations. Written apology from the board to be sent to all partners. And Lucas Grant's termination agreement must include a clause that he can never work in international trade again. Silence. Then, the non-compete for Grant might not be legal. Then make it very expensive for anyone to hire him. I'm sure Patricia Wu can be creative. I need to discuss with the board. You have 1 hour. Richard, after that, I'll be accepting other offers. Magnus Eriksson has already suggested I establish my own firm with backing from the Oslo Group. Yamamoto wants me to head their new American division. Klaus Weber is offering me a partnership in Frankfurt. 1 hour. I hung up and turned to Jennifer. What do you think? I think Lucas Grant is about to learn what it's like to be unemployable. At 5:12, my phone buzzed with a message from Sarah Brennan. Lucas's former shadow. Ms. Hart, I wanted to apologize. I see now what you were trying to teach me. Lucas is being escorted out by security. He's not handling it well. I could imagine. The man who'd wanted to publicly humiliate me was now taking the same walk. But unlike my dignified exit, his was probably accompanied by screaming about lawsuits and conspiracies. At 5:23, a video appeared on social media. Someone had filmed Lucas being escorted out, his face red, shouting about being set up. His carefully styled hair was disheveled, his Tom Ford suit wrinkled. The security guards looked embarrassed as he ranted about that woman destroying everything. The comments were brutal. Someone had already started a meme, "Don't be a Lucas," meaning don't fire the person holding your empire together. At 5:28, Patricia Wu called. "Evelyn, I've been asked to inform you that Mr. Grant's company assets have been frozen pending investigation. His corporate cards have been canceled. His executive assistant has been instructed to pack his office. Also, we've discovered some interesting irregularities in his expense accounts that the SEC will probably want to examine." Of course there were irregularities. Lucas's type always thought rules didn't apply to them. At 5:31, exactly 1 hour after Richard's call, my phone rang. "The board has agreed to all your terms," Richard said, sounding exhausted. "Can you start tomorrow?" "Monday," I corrected. "I need the weekend to call every partner and begin rebuilding what Lucas destroyed. Have the contracts ready for my signature Monday morning. And Richard, my first act as CEO will be to review the board's composition. I hope everyone understands that." "Understood." I ended the call and looked out at the Manhattan skyline. Somewhere out there, Lucas Grant was probably in his Tribeca apartment, watching his world burn on every financial news channel. His LinkedIn profile would be toxic. His country club membership would quietly expire. The invitations would stop coming. The calls wouldn't be returned. But I wasn't thinking about Lucas anymore. I was thinking about the 12 CEOs who'd stood up and walked out of that room, honoring the trust we'd built over years. Tomorrow, I'd call each of them personally. We'd laugh about the day's drama, and then we'd get back to business, real business, built on relationships, respect, and the understanding that in international commerce, trust wasn't just currency, it was everything. My phone buzzed with one final message. It was from Magnus Eriksson. "Congratulations on your promotion. CEO Hart, looking forward to signing those contracts properly. P.S. Lucas Grant just applied for a position with one of our competitors. I made sure they knew exactly what happened today." I smiled. Lucas Grant had wanted to erase me from Meridian's history. Instead, he'd written himself out of it entirely, and everyone in the industry would remember him as the man who fired Evelyn Hart and lost everything in less than 6 hours. Monday morning, 6:45 a.m. I stood in front of the Meridian Global building, holding the same leather portfolio I'd carried out 4 days ago. But this time, I wasn't entering as Senior Vice President of International Relations. The brass nameplate beside the CEO's private elevator had already been changed, Evelyn Hart, Chief Executive Officer. The security guard who'd taken my keycard on Thursday smiled broadly. "Welcome back, Ms. Hart. CEO Hart." "Thank you, Marcus. It's good to be back." The executive floor had been transformed over the weekend. Lucas's ostentatious modern art had been removed, replaced with the photographs I'd requested images from successful partnership ceremonies across 15 years. Faces of the people who'd built Meridian's international presence. His Crystal Awards for disruption excellence and innovation leadership were gone. In their place, handwritten thank you notes from partners in a dozen languages, now framed and displayed. My first meeting was with the 12 CEOs from Thursday's disaster. We connected via holographic conference, a technology Lucas had installed for show but never properly utilized. One by one, their faces appeared around the virtual table. "Evelyn," Magnus Eriksson began, "we've been discussing among ourselves over the weekend." My stomach tightened slightly. Had the damage been too severe? "We want to increase the partnership value," Yamamoto continued, "from 1.9 billion to 2.7 billion. We're also proposing a new structure, a consortium with Meridian at the center, but with you personally as the guarantor of stability." Klaus Weber added, "What happened Thursday showed us something important. You didn't just protect our interests with those clauses, you protected us from corporate instability. That level of foresight is worth investing in." By noon, we'd not only restored the original deals but expanded them significantly. The signing ceremony was simple. Dignified, no flashy presentations, no power plays, just 12 leaders coming together with mutual respect and shared purpose. The digital authentication system purred to life under my biometric signature, processing contracts that would define global trade routes for the next decade. At 2 p.m, I was in my office, Lucas's former shrine to his ego, now stripped back to elegant simplicity when Patricia Wu knocked. "Evelyn, you should see this. Lucas Grant has been charged with corporate fraud. Apparently, those expense account irregularities included billing personal vacations as business trips and selling insider information to competitors." I felt no satisfaction in his complete destruction, only a sense of poetic justice. He'd wanted to play emperor, but empires built on ego always fall. At 3:30, I held an all-hands meeting. The entire company gathered in the main auditorium, with international offices joining virtually. I looked out at hundreds of faces, many showing the strain of the past few days. "I'm not going to promise you disruption," I began. "I'm not going to promise innovation for its own sake. What I promise is this: we will build on trust, operate with integrity, and remember that business is ultimately about human relationships. The technology serves the people, not the other way around." The applause was genuine, relieved. These people had watched Lucas nearly destroy everything they'd worked for. They wanted stability, competence, leadership that understood the actual business, not just the buzzwords. That evening, as sunset painted Manhattan in shades of gold and amber, I sat in a small cafe 3 blocks from the office, the same one where I'd started drafting my next moves after being fired. My laptop was open, but instead of contracts or emergency strategies, I was writing something different, a manual for the next generation of international negotiators, a guide to building the kind of relationships that survive corporate upheavals and ego-driven executives. My phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. I almost ignored it, then noticed it was from a Swiss country code. The message was simple. "Ms. Hart, I heard about your promotion. I'm currently working as a consultant after my company terminated me unfairly. I wondered if you might have advice on recovering from such a betrayal. LG." Lucas Grant, messaging from Switzerland, where he'd apparently fled to avoid the SEC investigation. Still trying to manipulate, still trying to find an angle. I deleted the message without responding. Some bridges, once burned, weren't worth rebuilding. Another message arrived, this one from Sarah Brennan. "CEO Hart, I wanted to thank you. Watching everything unfold taught me more about business than my entire MBA. I understand now it's not about controlling the board. It's about knowing where all the pieces are before anyone else realizes there's a game being played." Smart girl. She'd learned the right lesson. I closed my laptop and looked around the cafe. Ordinary people living ordinary lives, unaware that billions of dollars in global trade had just been secured by someone drinking a $4 latte. They didn't know about the diplomatic clauses, the digital signatures, the carefully orchestrated collapse of a would-be corporate dictator. And that was fine. The best victories were the ones that looked inevitable in hindsight, as if they couldn't have happened any other way. Lucas had thought power meant being feared, being seen, being dominant, but real power was being essential, so woven into the fabric of operations that removing you unraveled everything. I paid for my coffee and stepped back onto the street. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new negotiations, new relationships to build. But tonight, I'd simply walk through the city I'd called home for 2 decades, knowing that sometimes the best revenge isn't destroying your enemy, it's letting them destroy themselves while you hold all the keys they didn't know existed. My phone showed 47 messages from headhunters, competitors, and media outlets wanting to know about the Meridian Miracle, how a company went from losing everything to gaining even more in just 4 days. I'd answer them eventually, with carefully crafted statements that revealed nothing of the real story. Because the truth was both simpler and more complex than anyone would believe. I'd spent 6 months preparing for a war Lucas Grant didn't know he'd already lost. He thought he was playing chess while I was playing Go, surrounding him so slowly, so subtly, that by the time he realized he was trapped, there were no moves left. The security token that had controlled $1.9 billion was still in my pocket, now just a piece of encrypted plastic. Its purpose served. I thought about throwing it away, then decided to keep it, a reminder that sometimes the smallest keys open the biggest doors, and that in the game of corporate power, the person who writes the rules usually wins. As I walked toward home, my phone rang one more time. It was my sister, calling from Boston. "Evie, I saw the news. CEO. Mom would be so proud." "Thanks, Linda. I think she would be. So what really happened? The news makes it sound like a miracle. I smiled, looking up at the darkening sky where the first stars were beginning to appear. Just business, Linda, just business. But we both knew it was more than that. It was 15 years of preparation, meeting one perfect moment of opportunity. It was proof that patience beats aggression, that wisdom beats ambition, and that sometimes, the best way to win is to let your opponent think they've already won right up until they realize they've lost everything. Thank you so much for listening to this story of corporate revenge and strategic brilliance. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from. Drop a comment below, and let's connect. If you enjoyed Evelyn's journey from termination to triumph, please subscribe to the channel and share your thoughts. What would you have done in her position? Let me know in the comments.